Chapter 6. The Forest Horror. The next day, after everything that had happened, Olena knew she needed to find answers. Her thoughts kept circling around the same question. What had happened in that forest? And who were the they the girl had mentioned? Was it just fear, or a cruel reality lurking in the shadows of the old forest? Olena went to see the local historian, an old man well-versed in the legends and myths of the area. His fascination with ancient stories and mystical events gave her hope that he might have some answers. The historian, sitting at his wooden desk in a room filled with books, listened to Olena attentively. When she finished recounting the story about the doll, the night calls, and the child's voice, he silently picked up an old book. Its cover was worn, and the pages had yellowed with age. "This is not just a legend," he began, looking at her seriously. "There are beings in the forest that the locals call forest shadows. They have existed for centuries. They are known as child snatchers. They lure children into their traps, promising happiness or protection, but in reality, they consume their souls, leaving behind only an empty shell." Olena listened in horror, but couldn't tear her eyes away from the historian. His voice carried a mixture of fear and despair. He continued, "They hate fire because it destroys their power. When a fire breaks out in the forest, these beings disappear, hiding in the shadows, but they never vanish completely. They wait. They wait for someone who can restore their power to appear once more." Olena felt a chill run through her. These beings, these forest shadows, could they be the reason for what happened to the family that lived in her house? And if they were real, then the child whose voice she heard must have been one of their victims. What happened to them? Why were they still here, even after the girl had died? With a newfound determination, Olena set out for the forest. She knew that danger awaited her, but fear could no longer hold her back. Armed only with a flashlight and an old lighter, she ventured into the darkness of the forest. Fire was her only protection. She had to find a way to break the connection between the girl and these creatures. When Olena reached the cabin, an uneasy feeling overcame her. Everything around her was silent. There were no birds, no rustling leaves. It was a deafening, terrifying silence that clearly signaled something was wrong. She approached the door, but before opening it, her gaze fell once again on the doll she had brought back from the forest. What surprised her the most was that the doll started moving on its own. At first, it was just a slight, almost invisible motion, but then it began rolling across the table as if it were on a string. Olena held her breath. This was impossible. The doll was old and damaged, yet now it looked alive. The cabin door creaked open, inviting her inside. Olena knew she couldn't hesitate. She stepped over the threshold. Her steps were slow but determined, and every move was filled with anticipation. What awaited her inside? Would she find the fire that could burn away these dark forces, or would she become their next victim? Chapter 7. The Last Call. The darkness that surrounded the cabin seemed to engulf it completely. Olena stood at the threshold, unsure if she was ready for what was about to happen, but an inner voice whispered to her, "You came here. You must do this." She stepped inside, and before her eyes unfolded a scene she would never forget. A telephone sat on an old wooden table by the window, exactly like the one she had in her attic. Its black casing looked familiar, but at that moment, it seemed to belong to another reality. Suddenly, it rang, making Olena flinch. She picked up the receiver, as if submitting to her own fear, and heard a familiar voice. "Is it you?" she asked, trying not to sound anxious. The girl's voice was quiet, as if coming from beyond this world, muffled like an echo from a distant cave. "They are here. They see you," the voice replied. Olena shuddered. The atmosphere around her grew more oppressive. She looked around the room. The walls seemed alive, dark, as if the room itself had begun to breathe. And from the corners, from the deepest shadows, figures gradually began to emerge. These were not just silhouettes. They were dark, indistinct forms that resembled human shapes, but their features were blurred and hazy. They moved slowly, like clouds of mist, coming closer and closer. Fear gripped her, but Olena remembered what the historian had told her. The creatures in the forest hated fire, and that was her only chance. She quickly pulled a match from her pocket and struck it. The flame danced at the tip, her hand trembled, but she brought it to the curtain hanging on the wall. The fire flared up instantly, filling the room with warmth. The approaching figures howled like wild beasts, and Olena realized that these shadows could not withstand the fire. The flames rapidly spread through the room, and the dark figures, which had once seemed invincible, became irrational and dissolved into the air. They vanished like smoke, leaving no trace or scent behind. Fire was their enemy. Suddenly the phone fell silent. All sounds ceased. Only now could Olena clearly hear her heart pounding in her chest. But in that same moment, another voice came through the speaker. It was a quiet, gentle whisper, almost invisible compared to the previous sounds. "Thank you. Now I can leave." This voice was calm, even peaceful, yet it carried deep gratitude. Olena felt a heavy weight lift from her heart, no matter how paradoxical it seemed. She had done it. She had freed the girl's soul. She had put an end to the horror that haunted her and others. Unable to bear looking at the fire any longer, Olena slowly stepped out of the cabin. The flames consumed the walls, but she no longer saw them as a threat. The cabin was empty. Its existence had come to an end. She had defeated the terror, breaking the seemingly endless cycle. The fog began to dissipate, and a cold wind carried away the last remnants of the fire, brushing against her face. Olena stood there, watching the burning heap disappear into the night darkness. She realized there was no one left to suffer anymore. But what remained in her heart? What would happen to her now that she had broken the cycle? The girl's soul was free, but the pain and suffering had left a deep mark on her own soul. She approached the edge of the forest, stretching before her, and her gaze grew distant, as if she had become part of this story, a story with no end. Chapter 8. The Final Call. Returning home, Olena felt that her life had to move forward. The terrifying nights, the calls, the dark forest creatures, they were now behind her, left in the past. She had freed the girl's soul, ended the nightmares that haunted her. Now, all that remained was to keep going, no matter how difficult it was. However, there was one thing she couldn't leave behind: the old telephone that had become such an integral part of her nightmare. It was no longer just an antique. It was a symbol of her experienced fear. Olena decided to get rid of it so that it would no longer remind her of what had happened, and to ensure that no other souls would be drawn into her life. She took it to an antique shop, hoping it would find a new home where it would no longer pose a threat. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with thick gray mustache, carefully examined the phone when Olena placed it on the counter. His eyes lit up slightly, and he smiled. "Oh, this is a rare piece. Are you sure you want to sell it? This phone has quite an interesting history." Olena nodded, her hand still clutching her bag, while memories of the phone ringing at night and the little girl's voice lingered in her mind. She couldn't bear this burden any longer. As she stepped out of the shop, she felt relief, as if she was breathing fresh air after a long, dark storm. It seemed like everything she had feared was finally behind her. But as soon as she stepped onto the sidewalk and glanced back, something unsettled her. Her